Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're going to be doing another battleship comparison video that a viewer like you suggested, and today we're going to compare New Jersey to the Nelrods, HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, the first treaty battleships, the only British battleships to have 16-inch guns, the only British battleships to have two propellers, and some of the most ingenious rethinking of battleship design that ever took place. So, Nelson and Rodney were the first ships built under the Washington Naval Treaty. 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty says that there will be no new battleships built for a set number of years, and future battleships will be limited to 35,000 tons and 16-inch main guns. Well, Great Britain just got out of World War I, and during that war, they had slowed down their battleship construction, so other countries had started to catch up to them, and their pre-war quota of having a larger navy than the next two combined was no longer going to be possible. At that point, the largest gun on a British battleship was 15 inches, although some of their large light cruisers / carriers and monitors had single 18-inch guns, but those were quickly gotten rid of. It wasn't very effective. So their largest ships had 15-inch guns. The largest Japanese and American ships had 16-inch guns. So Great Britain was able to argue during the treaty writing process that they would get to build a new class of battleships to treaty standards, but in order to keep them on par with the United States and Japan. And they would decommission some of their older, war-worn 12-inch armed dreadnoughts that were going to be scrapped anyway. And the British negotiators really did a good job of getting what they wanted. Now, prior to the Washington Naval Treaty, Great Britain had created a series of designs for what a modern battleship would look like. And these designs were way ahead of anything that other countries were doing. These designs were essentially modern battleships 20 or 30 years ahead of their time. And the final designs they settled on were known as G3, which was going to be the battle cruiser design, really was a fast battleship, and the N3 designs. And these designs, if you guys are interested, we'll probably compare to the Iowas in a separate video because they are closer in size and combat power to Iowa than the diminished Nelsons were. But these designs were really great, and they were going to be super expensive. So by Great Britain getting everybody else to cancel their already under construction battleships while they canceled these paper tigers, so to speak, and then being able to build a cheaper variant that was still ahead of what everyone else was doing, Great Britain won the Washington Naval Treaty. So, G3 was going to be a fast battleship, heavily armored, with 9 16-inch guns, 2 of them forward of the superstructure, 1 of them aft of the forward superstructure, and then an after superstructure behind that. And the N3 battleships were going to be the same, a little bit slower, heavier armor, and 9 18-inch guns. These ships were innovative because they pushed the entire main battery up forward. The main battery is what you really have to armor, the magazines for those big guns. And if you can crunch them all together instead of doing like New Jersey has, where some are on one side of the ship and the others are on the back end of the ship, well, now you have shrunk your armored belt and you've saved a lot of weight on armor, which means that your armor can be thicker. The engineering spaces are another aspect that need to be heavily armored, but by pushing those to the back of the ship, you're also saving weight because now you don't have to run your propeller shafts half of the length of the ship like we do on New Jersey. That you can run them a much shorter distance. And it creates a balanced design. When you put the turrets at the ends of the ship, the ends of your ship, which are the least buoyant because it gets narrower there, start to sag. So you have to spend a lot of weight, money, steel to reinforce those ends of the ship. If you've got the guns in the middle of the ship around the superstructure, you've saved a lot of that issue. Your ship is wider there. You can have a deeper torpedo defense, and you don't need to make such a structurally big ship there. So really, really, really ahead of their times designs, and those designs would spawn both Nelson and Rodney, and then a couple of other actually built and designed ships around the world. So, Nelson and Rodney, they had to cut some 10,000 or more tons off of their N3 battlecruisers. And these ships were the first ships that were fully designed with World War I experience in mind. So one, they really loved their 15-inch Marquand guns. It was a really great weapon system. Perhaps the best battleship gun to ever come out of the United Kingdom. But they wanted something with a little bit more firepower, so they went with the 16-inch gun, which is contemporary. The Japanese and Americans were doing it at the same time. Germany was not allowed to build battleships following World War I. So, they did have captured German battleships that they looked at, and earlier British battleships had used a theory similar to New Jersey, in that you fire a heavier shell at lower velocity. That heavy shell is going to hit with a lot of force, and at lower velocity, you lob it up in the air and it's going to fall through an enemy's deck armor, and the speed doesn't matter. It's the size of that shell just barreling through armor. Well, they looked at some German ships which had used a much lighter shell at a higher velocity, and they liked that idea. So their 16-inch guns were higher velocity, lower shell weight. And they tested this for a while, and they really didn't like their 16-inch turret design. It was overly complex. They had to do a lot of weight savings. They had to use a lot of aluminum in place of steel, and aluminum causes dissimilar metal corrosion when combined with steel, and it's not as tough, so you rub aluminum and it starts to wear away a lot quicker than steel. And they had a number of issues with these guns, and they eventually decided, all right, we're going to go with a lower velocity, higher shell weight. So they had to reline their barrels as that came up. So the higher velocity barrels needed to be relined quicker. So as the barrels needed relining, they would reline them one at a time. And then that caused huge dispersal problems because their fire control computers are plotting a single solution, but their gun barrels have different velocities and different shell weights, so the shells are going every which way, and they had some trouble hitting targets because of that. By World War II, these problems had mostly been solved, and these ships served with distinction, and their gunnery was perfectly acceptable. HMS Rodney, in terrible need of a yard period, was able to put 40 or more salvos into the battleship Bismarck, and her 16-inch shells at close range were able to do tremendous damage to the heavily armored German super battleship. So very few failures there. It was a completely acceptable weapon system by wartime. But as initially built in the 20s, it was new technology, and it had some teething problems. Another striking feature of the ship, besides having all of the guns concentrated forward, was the Citadel-type superstructure. These were the first battleships to go from a tripod or a military mast or like an open bridge structure to an actual enclosed superstructure. In this case, it was octagonal, and the crews called it the octopoidal. This enclosed structure was really, really well loved by the bridge crew, the navigators, who now are inside to do all their work, as opposed to on other ships where they're on the outside. It does act like a huge weather vane, so in winds, they do tend to blow the ship around some. But knowing that that is a thing that happens to these ships, the helmsman can easily correct. And so these ships started out with a bad reputation for maneuverability, but by the end of their careers, when everybody knew how they worked, they were some of the most maneuverable British battleships. Another issue with the maneuverability was they were the only British battleships to have two propellers, and because they were fairly wide, the propellers didn't blow water across the rudder. They had a single rudder, so that also caused navigation issues. Not so much when you're going ahead, but if these ships ever had to go astern, it caused some issues. As far as the engineering side of things go, now that we've started talking about that, really interesting engineering arrangement. They had the engine rooms forward and the fire rooms aft, and this way, putting the boilers aft put the funnel far away from the superstructure. That meant that exhaust gases and smoke wasn't obscuring the gunnery spotting positions on the superstructure. So that was a good idea, but it sort of defeated the whole idea of moving the engine rooms further aft so you can shorten the length of the engineering plant. So these ships had really anemic power plants as far as post-Washington Naval Treaty battleships go. In terms of warships of the 1920s, their 23 knot speed was sufficient. They were faster than a lot of Royal Navy battleships. They were faster than any U.S. Navy battleships. They were thought to be on par with Japanese battleships. However, the Japanese had lied about the speed of their ships, and they were actually a couple knots faster. But their 23 knot main speed was perfectly fine in the 1920s, but these were the slowest treaty battleships ever built. All of the other ones got well over 27 knots or above. But they were built in the late 30s, early 40s when speed was a thing. So with 35,000 tons to work with, you cannot have the best guns, sufficient armor, and a high speed. So the British decided, hey, during Jutland, we had these really fast battle cruisers that were super maneuverable, but they blew up pretty frequently. So they thought, maneuverability is not the key to future battles. We're going to be sailing broadside to broadside. We can throw speed out the window. By the same token, these ships don't have the same endurance as New Jersey. They only have about half of the range. And that wasn't because they couldn't have more range. The British negotiated into the treaty that your fuel and boiler feed water wouldn't count against your ship's displacement, so that them having to operate around the world wouldn't be penalized for the fuel they carry. That's not taken out of those 35,000 tons. However, this was a deliberate design choice because Britain was a great colonial power at the time. They had to operate around the world, but they had refueling stations around the world. So they didn't need super long-range ships because they can stop on any continent and there's a British base to refuel from. Except maybe Antarctica at this point. So the range, less than what the American ships have, designed to operate in the expanses of the Pacific, but more than sufficient and more than most European battleships had. Comparing it to the Littorio, which we talked about in a previous week, that was just designed to operate in the Mediterranean, she had downright huge bunkers. Now, let's get into the armor and torpedo defense. The Nelson and Rodney, the Nelrods, had pretty good innovative defenses. They had an angled belt, like the Iowa-class battleships that was pioneered on Hood a generation earlier. They had that belt internal, like the Iowa-class battleships. And this meant that armor-piercing shells coming in would be decapped by the shell plating and would have to punch through a series of void and liquid-loaded spaces before hitting the 14-inch armored belt. So this was a really great pioneering aspect that was then used on the Iowa-class. Now, the issue with that is really small shells can punch through the shell plating and your ship can start to take on water. That was a concern with the Nelrods. That was a concern with the Iowas and the South Dakota class. But as it turns out, no ships ever succumbed to damage like that. And it wasn't a huge issue, but it was a concern that they had. They also included the layered torpedo defense, which is common on American battleships, where you have a series of void spaces and liquid loaded spaces to absorb a torpedo's impact. And these ships were a little bit shorter than the Iowas, about 710 feet long, and about the same width, a little over 100 feet wide. So they had fairly comparable torpedo defenses, and it was a huge step up from the earlier crushing tubes used on ships like HMS Hood. And check out our video, link in the description below, for our video on torpedo defenses. But these ships, really similar guns to the Iowas, really similar armor to the Iowas. Where they lose fighting power from their 10,000-ton deficiency to the Iowas is in their speed. But these are very much a building block on the way to the Iowa-class battleships, and they're a very good class of ships that get a bad reputation from their early teething problems, but by World War II, it had all been sorted out, and if they had have had a little bit more speed, they would have had more utility, but they sure found themselves all over the world. In the Mediterranean fighting Italian battleships, in the Atlantic fighting German battleships, doing shore bombardment at Normandy, and then they also operated in the Indian Ocean, holding the line against the Japanese. So tremendously long-lived ships that the British really got their money's worth out of. There's one huge detraction to take away from these ships. They look god-awful. They with the whole main battery up forward, the funnels pushed all the way back, they look like oil tankers or barges or something. They look really bad. I've never been a fan of the British Citadel-style superstructure, which these ships pioneered and would be used in all subsequent British battleships and a lot of cruisers and other smaller ships. So I don't think they look good. Another innovation of these ships, they were, I believe, the first battleships to have a turreted secondary battery. They used 6-inch guns in twin turrets, 6 of them, on the superstructure. This had been a design in the N3 and the G3, but it was actually employed on the Nelrods. This meant that they had a mixed secondary battery of 6-inch guns for firing at lighter ships, and then single mount open anti-aircraft guns. So their anti-aircraft battery left something to be desired by World War II standards. By the standards of the 1920s, it was perfectly adequate. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future battleships for us to compare, drop them in the comment section down below. If you are interested in supporting the channel or the museum, check the description below for ways you can donate. And remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you get notified when we're creating future videos. Thanks for watching.